Imagine standing in a quiet field at dawn. The soil is cool, the air still, and in your hand rests a small seed of bamboo. To the eye, it looks like nothing remarkable, just a tiny speck of life, fragile and easily overlooked. Yet hidden within it lies a power so immense, it can one day rise taller than houses, sway gracefully in the fiercest storms, and stand as a symbol of resilience across cultures. You press the seed into the earth, cover it gently with soil, and begin the long wait. Days turn into weeks. Weeks stretch into months, and as the seasons pass, something unsettling happens. Nothing, absolutely nothing. No sprout, no sign of green, no proof that your effort means anything at all. It's in this silence, this void, where impatience begins to whisper. Why bother? Why keep watering? Why keep caring for something that refuses to grow? And perhaps this is the most human struggle of all, our desire for results before their time. In our modern world, we are trained to crave speed. We tap a screen and food arrives at our door. We click a button and information floods our minds. Everything shouts now, faster, instantly. And so, when life demands patience, it feels unbearable. But what if this silence isn't empty at all? What if beneath the surface something far more important is happening, something we cannot yet see? This is where the story of the bamboo begins, not in the moment it shoots high into the sky, but in the years where nothing seems to happen. The years when growth hides beneath the soil, weaving unseen foundations, stretching roots deep into the earth. Buddhist teachings remind us that patience is not weakness. It is not idle waiting. It is strength disguised as stillness. In Sanskrit, it is called K-163, a macron, and Ti, the perfection of endurance. The Buddha taught that without patience, wisdom cannot ripen, compassion cannot deepen, and the heart cannot awaken. Think of your own life for a moment. How many times have you given up on something because the results didn't come fast enough? How often have you judged your progress only to forget that the most sacred work happens invisibly, within the mind, within the heart? When you sit in meditation, it can feel like nothing is happening. The mind wanders, the body aches, the thoughts keep spinning, and yet below the surface, transformation is already taking root. Each breath is laying a foundation, each return to the present moment is stretching unseen roots into the soil of your being. The story of the bamboo is not just a parable, it is a mirror, showing us our own impatience, our own restless longing for immediate reward. But it also offers us a promise that the stillness we often fear is the very ground where true growth begins. So here, at the beginning, let us pause. Let us stand with the farmer who waters his bamboo seed every single day, with no sign of life to reassure him. Let us walk into the silence of the soil, into the unseen world where faith and patience intertwine. Because before the bamboo rises, before it astonishes the world with its sudden height, it teaches us its first and most vital lesson. Patience begins in silence. And as we lean closer to this silence, something hidden starts to stir, deep below the earth. Roots begin to awaken. Beneath the quiet earth, where no eyes can see, a miracle is unfolding. Though the farmer sees only bare soil, the bamboo seed is alive, busy, determined. Its roots push deeper and deeper, weaving a vast network beneath the surface, anchoring, strengthening, preparing for the life that will one day break into the light. It is here in the darkness that the true work begins. We often think growth should be visible, measurable in achievements, promotions, or recognition. Yet real transformation almost always starts where no one can see. Just as the bamboo builds its hidden roots, our spiritual lives develop in silence. Meditation may seem uneventful on the outside, but within, the mind is quietly training, slowly loosening its grip on restlessness and craving. The Buddha often compared the mind to a field. If the soil is not prepared, no crop will thrive. Patience, discipline, and practice are the hidden tilling of this inner ground. Each act of kindness, each mindful breath, each choice to stay rather than run, these are the roots that hold us steady when life's storms arrive. But the hidden work is the hardest to trust, because it asks us to believe in something we cannot yet see. The farmer waters day after day, season after season, with no green shoot to reward his effort. He chooses faith over doubt, commitment over frustration. Isn't that what our lives ask of us too? To keep walking even when the path feels endless. To keep loving even when the world doesn't return our tenderness. To keep practicing even when the mind resists. Modern life rarely honors the unseen. We celebrate results, not process. We admire the towering bamboo, but we forget the years it spent underground, building the strength to rise. The danger of this forgetfulness is that we compare our roots to someone else's shoots. We see their success, their joy, their peace, and wonder why ours has not arrived. But comparison blinds us to our own hidden work, the slow forming of roots that will one day carry us higher than we imagined. In Buddhism, patience is more than waiting, it is trust in the invisible. Trust that the seeds we plant with right effort, with mindfulness, with compassion, will one day bear fruit. Just as the bamboo does not doubt its own timing, we too must learn to trust the pace of our growth. If you look at your life right now, where are your roots growing? Perhaps you are learning resilience through struggle, compassion through heartbreak, wisdom through uncertainty. None of it shows on the surface, but every moment of endurance is strengthening your foundation. The bamboo whispers to us, do not despise the days of hidden labor. Do not measure your worth by what the world can see. The deepest work always begins where no eyes can reach. And so the years pass. The farmer keeps tending, the roots keep spreading. And the silence above the soil continues. But in that silence, something extraordinary is gathering strength, an invisible promise preparing to break into the open sky. Picture the farmer once more. Morning after morning, he walks out to the field with a bucket of water in his hands. The soil looks the same as yesterday, dry, empty, bare, no green shoots, no signs of progress, no proof that anything is alive beneath the surface. And yet he waters anyway. There is no applause for his effort, no reward for his persistence. Neighbors pass by and shake their heads. Some laugh, others pity him. Why waste your time on a barren patch of earth? They whisper, but the farmer smiles quietly and returns each day to pour life into what others cannot see. This is faith, not the kind of faith that demands proof, not the kind of faith that clings to instant results, but a deeper, quieter faith, the trust that unseen roots are forming, that hidden growth is already at work, that patience will one day be rewarded. Buddhism speaks of saddha, the faith that sustains the path. It is not blind belief, but confidence born from experience. When you sit in meditation and breathe, when you return to the present moment despite distractions, you are practicing this faith. You may not feel the change immediately, but trust allows you to continue. Faith is what holds us steady when the world tells us to quit. Think of the times in your life when you felt like that farmer, working, waiting, giving with nothing to show for it. Maybe you've studied for years without recognition. Maybe you've poured your heart into relationships, into dreams, into practices, and wondered if any of it mattered. The truth is, every act of effort waters the roots beneath your life, and one day they will rise. The farmer's trust is not naive. He does not demand the bamboo grow faster. He knows its nature. He respects its timing. This is wisdom woven into patience, the understanding that life unfolds at its own pace. The Buddha often reminded his disciples that awakening is gradual, like the rising of the dawn. You cannot rush the sun and you cannot force the bamboo. And so the farmer's daily walk becomes a ritual, almost like a meditation. Each step to the field is an act of devotion. Each drop of water is an offering to the unseen. He is not watering just the soil, he is watering his own trust, his own perseverance, his own heart. This is the power of trust. It transforms waiting into practice and uncertainty into strength. In a world addicted to immediate gratification, faith is radical. It is choosing to believe in what cannot yet be seen. It is the courage to continue, even when the harvest is still far away. And it is this courage, this unseen faith, that makes the eventual rise of the bamboo so astonishing. Because when the day comes, when the soil finally breaks open and the bamboo shoots upward, it will not only be a triumph of nature, but also a triumph of trust. For now, though, the field remains silent. The farmer continues his daily walk, holding faith as his only reward. And in the quiet darkness beneath his feet, the roots keep spreading, reaching further, preparing for something extraordinary that has yet to come. There comes a moment when the silence feels unbearable. The farmer looks over the barren soil once again, and doubt begins to creep in. How many mornings has he walked this path? How many days has he poured water into ground that refuses to respond? This is the hardest season of all, the season of stillness. Stillness has a way of testing us. When nothing seems to move, our minds grow restless. We begin to question not just the work, but ourselves. Am I doing something wrong? Am I wasting my time? Should I give up and start over somewhere else? It is in these moments that people often abandon their dreams, their practice, their path, not because they failed, but because they mistook silence for emptiness. But silence is not emptiness. It is the secret space where roots deepen. In Buddhism, this is the nature of practice. You may sit in meditation for months and feel no progress. The mind still wanders. Old habits return. Frustration rises like weeds in a field. Yet beneath the surface, subtle shifts are happening. The mind is learning how to pause. The heart is learning how to soften. The roots of awareness are slowly, invisibly spreading. The illusion of stillness is that nothing is changing, but everything is changing. Consider the seed buried underground. To the farmer, the field looks lifeless. But within the soil, cells are dividing, roots are stretching, energy is gathering. Transformation is happening at a pace too quiet for the eye to notice. The same is true of us. Healing, growth, wisdom, they often unfold beneath the surface of our daily awareness. Modern life doesn't prepare us for this. We measure success by speed. We are taught that if we don't see results immediately, something must be broken. But the bamboo whispers a different truth, that stillness is not wasted time, but sacred time. The Buddha often spoke of sati, mindfulness, as the art of noticing what is present without judgment. When nothing seems to happen, mindfulness reveals the miracle of simply being. The breath moves in and out. The body lives moment by moment. Even in silence, life is unfolding. Think of the ocean. On its surface, waves may seem calm, almost motionless. but beneath, powerful currents are moving, shaping tides, carrying life across vast distances. Stillness is never truly still. So when you find yourself in a season where nothing seems to happen, remember, the roots are at work. The quiet is not a punishment, but a preparation. Every day you endure with patience, you are building strength for what will come. The farmer does not quit. Though the soil mocks him with silence, he continues his rhythm, watering, waiting, trusting. What he cannot see is that beneath his feet, the bamboo is already preparing for its breathtaking rise. And when that rise comes, it will shatter the illusion of stillness forever. One morning after years of silence, something shifts. The farmer steps into the field expecting the same barren view, the same unbroken soil. But this time his eyes catch a flicker of green, a sprout, thin, fragile, almost shy in its appearance, but unmistakably alive. And then, as if released from years of waiting, the bamboo surges upward with breathtaking speed. Each day it grows taller, stretching higher than the farmer's shoulders, higher than the rooftops, higher than anything he has ever tended. In just a few short weeks, the once empty field transforms into a forest of towering stalks, strong yet graceful, swaying with the wind. This is the miracle of the bamboo, years of nothing, weeks of everything. To the casual observer, it looks like magic. How could something grow so fast, they wonder, but the farmer knows it was not sudden at all. It was the years of unseen labor, the patient watering, the faithful tending, the invisible roots that made this possible. What appeared overnight was in truth the harvest of years. And isn't life often the same? We look at someone who seems to succeed suddenly, an artist whose name is everywhere, a meditator who radiates calm, a person who seems wise beyond their years, and we think it happened overnight. But what we don't see are the countless hours of unseen work, the struggles in silence, the roots that grew in the dark. The bamboo's rise is a reminder. Transformation looks sudden, but it is always built in silence. In Buddhism, awakening is often described as a moment of sudden clarity, a flash of insight that shatters delusion. But this moment does not come from nowhere. It is prepared by years of practice, each breath, each step, each act of mindfulness laying the roots for awakening to bloom. Think of your own life. There will come a time when all the effort you thought was wasted will suddenly converge. The skills you practiced in obscurity, the lessons learned in silence, the patience you held through disappointment, they will all rise together, and others will call it sudden. But you will know the truth. The bamboo does not apologize for its timing. It does not rush to match the expectations of others. It grows when it is ready, and when it rises beyond measure. There is a lesson here for every restless heart. Do not measure your journey by today's results. Trust the roots you are growing, because when your time comes, your rise will be unstoppable. And as the farmer stands in his field, surrounded by towering bamboo that once hid beneath the soil, he realizes something profound. The years of waiting were not wasted, they were essential. The silence was not empty. It was preparing him, not just the bamboo, for this very moment. The illusion of stillness has shattered, transformation has arrived, and with it, a deeper teaching begins to unfold. As the bamboo towers above the earth, the farmer finally breathes with ease. What once felt like endless waiting has now blossomed into a living forest. Yet hidden within this story is not just a lesson about nature. It is one of the great teachings of the Buddha himself, the perfection of patience, known in Sanskrit as Kṣānti and Ti. Patience, in the Buddhist sense, is far more than waiting politely for something to happen. It is the strength to remain steady in the face of discomfort, the courage to endure without resentment, the wisdom to accept life as it unfolds. Kṣānti and Ti is often translated as forbearance or endurance. But in truth, it is the art of being unshaken. It is the ability to meet anger without anger, hardship without bitterness, silence without despair. Think again of the farmer. For years, he stood before an empty field. Many would have cursed the soil, blamed the seed, or abandoned the work altogether. But the farmer's patience was not passive, it was active. Each day he chose to water. Each day he chose to believe. His patience was alive, moving, disciplined. That is Kṣānti and Ti. In the scriptures, the Buddha taught that patience is greater than all ascetic practices. Why? Because it transforms suffering into strength. Anyone can sit in meditation when conditions are perfect. But true practice is tested when things are difficult, when insults sting, when effort seems fruitless, when life feels unbearably still. To remain steady, then, is to embody Kṣānti and Ti. We often mistake patience for weakness, as if waiting means doing nothing. But in reality, patience is one of the most radical forms of power. To resist the urge for instant gratification. To endure without collapsing into anger or despair. To hold steady when the world around us demands speed. This is strength few possess. Think of a flame in the wind. Without patience, it flickers and dies. With patience, it learns to bend, to dance, to endure until the storm passes. The bamboo is patient. For years it grows unseen, not because it is lazy or slow, but because it knows the importance of foundation. Its strength lies in its restraint, and when the time is right, it rises, not a weak sprout, but a towering presence. K letter 1E63A Macron NTI calls us to the same, to trust the pace of our growth, to stop fighting the rhythm of life, to endure life's insults and struggles not with clenched fists but with a calm heart. And here lies the secret. Patience does not mean suppressing our pain. It means embracing it without letting it consume us. It means saying, yes, this moment is hard, but it will not break me. I will keep watering my roots. Imagine how different our lives would feel if we lived with this kind of patience. Arguments would lose their fire. Failures would lose their sting. Waiting would no longer feel like punishment, but like preparation. This is why patience is not just a virtue, it is a perfection. It perfects the mind, tempers the heart, and makes us unshakable. The bamboo has already shown us, patience is not about doing nothing. It is about building silently until the time of transformation arrives. And so, as the wind brushes against the bamboo's tall stalks, they do not break. They bend, they sway, they endure. And in their gentle movement, they echo the Buddha's teaching. The strongest are not those who resist change, but those who embrace it with patience. When we look at the bamboo, we do not just see a plant, we see ourselves. The story of its hidden roots, its sudden rise, its graceful resilience, it is not only nature's tale, but a mirror reflecting the rhythms of human life. Think of a student buried in books, studying late into the night. For years, there may be no recognition, no applause, no visible reward. It feels like pouring water into barren soil, yet unseen, knowledge is gathering. Skills are forming, and then one day in an exam room or in a career, that hidden work bursts into sight, just like the bamboo breaking the earth. Think of an artist painting in obscurity. Their canvases pile up in quiet rooms, uncelebrated, unnoticed. Friends may doubt, family may question, but they continue anyway. And then one day their work reaches the world and people call them an overnight success. But the artist knows nothing was sudden. Every silent hour of practice was a root growing deeper. Or think of love. True love does not appear fully formed. It grows quietly through patience, through misunderstandings endured, through trust built over time. Like bamboo, the roots must be strong before the relationship can stand tall. Without this unseen work, it cannot last. And what of the spiritual path? The same pattern appears. Meditation feels like stillness. Mindfulness feels ordinary, but over time, the heart begins to soften, anger loosens, compassion grows. Then one day a moment arrives when the mind sees clearly. Impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and awakening feels sudden. Yet it is only the visible rise of years of hidden practice. The bamboo, then, is not just a plant. It is a living parable of human growth. Its silence teaches us to trust the process. Its patience teaches us to respect timing. Its sudden rise teaches us to never underestimate quiet effort. Its strength in storms teaches us flexibility. In fact, one of the most remarkable traits of bamboo is its ability to bend without breaking. When strong winds blow, trees often fall, but bamboo sways, dances with the storm, and when the winds pass, it stands tall again. What a perfect image for resilience in human life, because storms will come, failures will strike, hearts will break, and yet, like bamboo, we too can learn to bend without breaking. This is why so many cultures revere bamboo, not only for its usefulness, but for its symbolism. In Japan, it is a symbol of prosperity. In China, it represents strength and integrity. And in Buddhism, it whispers a quieter lesson, that growth is both hidden and sudden, and that the strongest are those who endure with patience and grace. If you pause and reflect, you will see bamboo's story repeating everywhere around you, in the silent sacrifices of parents, in the quiet perseverance of workers, in the unseen kindness of strangers. These are roots growing in the dark, preparing for a rise the world may never fully see. The farmer's field is our world. Each of us is a bamboo seed, carrying within us the potential to rise, to bend, to endure, to transform. The question is, will we trust the silence long enough to let that potential unfold? The bamboo answers without words. Its very life is a teaching, showing us that growth, whether in nature or in human life, is never wasted, only hidden, only waiting for its time. Beneath every towering bamboo forest lies a secret, an unseen world of roots woven deep into the soil. Without them, no stalk could stand, no grove could flourish. The same is true of the spiritual path. What the world often sees is only the surface, a serene monk walking slowly, a practitioner sitting quietly in meditation, a teacher speaking words of wisdom. But beneath these visible acts lie roots that no one notices, the silent disciplines, the small sacrifices, the steady practice that anchors the soul. In Buddhism, these hidden roots are the foundations of practice. The precepts, the cultivation of mindfulness, the effort to tame the restless mind, the compassion extended when no one is watching. They are not glamorous, they do not draw applause, yet without them the tree of wisdom cannot grow. Consider the precepts, the simple commitments not to harm, not to steal, not to deceive, not to cloud the mind. At first glance, they seem restrictive, even small, but like roots, they give stability. They prevent the mind from toppling in storms of guilt, fear, or regret. They create the quiet soil in which deeper practice can take root. Then there is meditation. To the casual observer, it looks like stillness. A person sitting, eyes closed, doing nothing. But inside, entire forests are growing. Each breath is a root. Each moment of awareness extends deeper into the soil of the mind. And though nothing seems to happen, beneath the surface, the foundations of awakening are quietly weaving together. And what about compassion? So often compassion is hidden, unnoticed, uncelebrated. It is the kind words spoken when anger would have been easier. The patience extended when irritation was at the door. The silent prayer for another's well-being. These acts, invisible to the world, are roots nourishing the soul's strength. The danger comes when we seek only what is visible: status, recognition, spiritual experiences that can be shown off. That is like planting bamboo and expecting it to rise without roots. It will fall, it cannot last. The Buddha himself spent years cultivating roots before his enlightenment. He practiced generosity, endured hardship, trained his mind with unshakable effort. When awakening finally came, it appeared sudden, like the bamboo's rise, but it was rooted in countless lifetimes of preparation. And so, when you feel like your spiritual life is invisible, when your practice seems unnoticed, remember the bamboo. Roots are meant to be unseen. Their power lies in their hiddenness. Do not underestimate the quiet disciplines you carry each day. The small choices to be honest, the effort to breathe mindfully, the compassion that goes unthanked. These are roots growing deeper, preparing you for a rise you cannot yet imagine. The bamboo does not flaunt its roots, it trusts them. So must we, for when the time comes, those hidden roots will hold you steady through storms. And they will lift you toward heights of wisdom and compassion that cannot be shaken. The invisible, in the end, is what makes the visible possible. Across centuries, across cultures, the bamboo has stood as a silent teacher. Yet its lessons are not trapped in the past. They are alive, urgent, and deeply needed in our modern age. Look around. The world today moves at breathtaking speed. Notifications light up our phones. Deadlines chase us. Trends rise and fade in the blink of an eye. In such a restless climate, patience feels almost impossible. We are trained to want results now, to see growth instantly, to measure worth by speed and visibility. And yet bamboo whispers, slow down, roots first. In our careers, we often feel pressure to rise quickly, to show titles, promotions, recognition. But bamboo teaches us that unseen preparation is never wasted. The years of learning, the skills built in silence, the humility of starting small, these are the roots that one day allow a person to rise with strength that lasts. In relationships, we crave intensity. We want instant connection, instant trust, instant love. But bamboo reminds us real bonds are rooted. They grow slowly, nurtured through patience, honesty, and care. When storms come, and they will, only relationships with deep roots will endure. In personal growth, we look for shortcuts, books that promise quick wisdom, apps that promise instant calm. But wisdom is not downloaded. Peace cannot be rushed. Like bamboo, the soul grows in hidden ways. In the daily choice to practice, to reflect, to endure. And in the noise of modern life, resilience is more essential than ever. Here too, bamboo guides us. It bends in storms without breaking. It sways but does not shatter. What a lesson for us living in a world of uncertainty. Flexibility, humility, adaptability, these are not signs of weakness but of strength. Even in sustainability, bamboo offers wisdom. It grows quickly, replenishes easily, and serves countless purposes, from shelter to nourishment. It teaches us that true strength is not exploitation but harmony. Imagine a modern world that lived by bamboo's example, resilient, renewable, balanced with nature. The ancient farmers who tended bamboo may not have known the language of neuroscience or psychology, but they understood something timeless, that true growth cannot be forced, that patience is power, that silence holds strength. And perhaps this is why the story of bamboo resonates so deeply, even now. Because no matter how modern our lives become, our hearts remain ancient. We still long for stability. We still need patience. We still seek roots, so when life feels rushed, when you are pressured to produce, to prove, to rise too soon, remember the bamboo. Remember that greatness grows underground first, that the strongest rise begins invisibly, that storms are survived not by rigidity but by grace. In the quiet strength of bamboo, ancient wisdom becomes modern truth. Stand now in the middle of a bamboo grove. The stalks rise high above you, straight yet gentle, whispering as the wind moves through their leaves. Light filters softly, and for a moment the world feels timeless. This is where our story rests. The bamboo has spoken to us not with words but with its life. It has shown us that silence is not emptiness, that waiting is not wasted, that the invisible holds more power than the visible. It has taught us that strength is not in standing rigid, but in bending with grace. That transformation, though it may look sudden, is always rooted in years of unseen labor. And as the bamboo rises tall, it reminds us that patience is not weakness. Patience is power. So how do we live this lesson? Perhaps it begins simply with trust. Trust that your efforts matter, even when unseen. Trust that growth is happening even when you cannot measure it. Trust that your roots are reaching deeper with every small act of honesty, kindness, and mindfulness. It also begins with presence. The bamboo does not compare itself to the oak or the pine. It grows as bamboo at its own pace in its own way. Can you do the same? Can you honor your path without measuring it against another's? And it begins with resilience. Life will bring storms, disappointments, failures, loss, but like bamboo, you can bend without breaking. You can sway without surrendering. You can rise again, taller for having endured. In the end, the lesson of bamboo is not just about patience. It is about living with trust, with resilience, with grace. It is about remembering that your life, like the bamboos, unfolds in cycles, roots first, then rise. Silence first, then song. As you walk away from this story, carry the bamboo with you. Let it remind you in moments of doubt that the invisible work you do today will one day burst into sight. Let it whisper to you in storms that bending is not failing. Let it stand tall in your memory as a symbol of patience that transforms into strength. And when your time comes, and it will, you too will rise, like the tall bamboo swaying in the wind, grounded in silence, reaching toward the sky. This is the final whisper of bamboo: be patient, be rooted, be resilient, and rise when it is time. If the story of the bamboo touched your heart, let it stay with you, not just as a tale, but as a reminder to live with patience, trust, and resilience. And if you wish to continue walking this path of wisdom, I invite you to join us here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe so these teachings can find you when you most need them. Share this with someone whose heart may be waiting for encouragement, and let us grow together like a forest of bamboo rooted in silence, rising in strength, swaying with compassion. The journey does not end here, it only deepens.